Welcome to How We Work Now, where we explore how people are reshaping the modern workplace through lived experience with neurodiversity, chronic illness, and disability. Today I'm joined by Alice Hargreaves, CEO and founder of SIC, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting people navigating life and work with chronic illness. Alice is a writer, speaker, and community builder who uses her lived experiences with respiratory conditions, multiple chronic illnesses, ADHD, anxiety, and depression to advocate for more honest, inclusive narratives around disability and long-term health. Through SIC, she has become a visible voice pushing back against stigma, challenging toxic productivity culture, and creating spaces where sick and disabled people can reclaim power, connection, and dignity. I'm thrilled to talk with her about how she is reshaping what leadership looks like when you build from lived experience, and I'm so glad to have you here with us today, Alice. Care to introduce yourself in your own words?
Yeah, absolutely. So I founded SIC, which is a non-profit social enterprise, 5 years ago now. I'd worked sort of in equity, diversity, and inclusion for quite a long time and hadn't ever really kind of focused on disability and chronic health. So SIC basically kind of became the opportunity to do that. And I would say there are sort of two real sides to the business. So one side is actually really focused on supporting businesses to actually do better when it comes to access and inclusion in their workplaces, mainly for their teams, but also for their customers as well. And then on the other side, we run a kind of bunch of different programs and provide a ton of different resources to disabled people really at any stage of their careers. And mainly it's stuff that I would have really appreciated when I was first starting out my own career.
I love that. I love seeing more kind of community building amongst disabled people for disabled people. So, how did your early work experiences shape your decision to create a community where sick and disabled people could feel understood instead of isolated?
Yeah, I mean, my career was absolutely like the epitome of like a portfolio career. I think the longest I'd been at any employer was about 19 months. And a lot of that was because I was deemed quite high risk because, I was kind of visibly taking sick days or visibly asking for adjustments. So whenever it came to things like promotions, I was pretty much always overlooked. So it meant that I had to effectively kind of move roles in order to really progress in my career. And that just became like increasingly frustrating and increasingly isolating, really. So when I kind of started SIC, which was originally with a co-founder, it was really kind of like creating the space that we kind of wish existed for ourselves. And yeah, I mean, those kind of like early career experiences of kind of constantly having to move my career, shift my goals, felt like I wasn't really kind of getting the adjustments that I needed, really kind of shaped the work that I do and really trying to kind of advocate for better working conditions for, the people that kind of come after me, really.
Were there specific moments that you experienced that really helped shift that mindset over to reimagining how you work and being more kind of open about your experiences?
I don't think there was like anything that sort of particularly did. Although I have to say, actually, the pandemic definitely did have quite a big shift for me. So I was in the UK, we had various kind of categories, and I was in what was kind of called the extremely clinically vulnerable category, which meant that I had to shield in the actually quite a substantial chunk of the pandemic. And it meant that for kind of the first time, I wasn't just kind of going, oh yeah, well, I've got a chronic illness and mental health challenges, etc. And that's the reason that I'm always having to move roles. It was very much like, actually, I'm having a very different experience to my friends and my peers who were, not carrying on as normal because, everybody was having to do various measures for the pandemic. But very much having a very different experience in terms of being, kept indoors for a really long time. And I think at that point it was kind of like, oh yeah, this is like a difference that actually kind of probably needs to be spoken about a little bit more. And on top of that as well, I really started finding like a community online of people going through really similar things. And it really helped me kind of find that sort of like pride in my own disabled identity, because, I was meeting all these like really amazing people who've become really great friends. And again, it was kind of like, okay, like this is kind of like shifting like the way I'm starting to think about this, and actually I need to kind of be a bit more of a voice. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of been through many iterations, but I definitely think that was kind of like the moment, that pandemic, where it was kind of like, oh, okay, like my experience has become very, very different to everyone around me.
So it kind of helped you to stop seeing yourself as, like, more or less the same. You just have some extra struggles, and they're
Yeah,
like, oh no, it's really something completely different, and it does need to be talked
yeah,
about. It's not just something you can sweep under
yeah,
the rug and pretend isn't there.
absolutely. And also it was kind of like, oh, all the people in my life at that point in time were having such a different experience, but actually all these people that kind of came into my life were having a really similar shared experience. And it kind of taught me a lot around that sort of like disability pride and understanding who I was quite a lot better. Um, which, yeah, all had, you know, an increased kind of like knock-on impact of um, starting to kind of openly talk about this and be much more of a advocate in workplaces when it came to sort of, getting them to think about what inclusion really can look like within their organizations. And, kind of almost being like, look, I will say the things that probably some of your team might want to say, but maybe feel a bit too scared to say. But yeah, it was definitely kind of the push that was kind of really needed. And I'd said for years that I wanted to move into self-employment because I knew it was going to be the most kind of accessible thing for me. Um, but probably, had 2020 not happened, it would probably have been a very different business. So yeah, it definitely had a massive kind of impact.
I think it's so interesting how the pandemic, while being a global travesty pandemic, was also really life-changing for so many disabled and chronically ill people because of the light
Yeah,
it shed on our conditions.
yeah,
I know, like, specifically I have POTS, is one of my conditions, and that doctors didn't know what the hell that was before the pandemic.
yeah,
And after the pandemic, because so many people got it as a result of COVID-19, suddenly there's all this research on POTS and better treatments available. And so it's like a double-edged sword where
yeah.
there are,
And I also
yeah.
think it's really changed the way that we work as well, because we're so much less
Yes.
reliant on, being 100% office based and all of those things. And I think, I know, for example, people in my network who, pre-pandemic were kind of working part-time because they were like, well, I can't go into the office
Mm,
5 days a week. And then as soon as there was the opportunity to actually work remotely, they were like, well,
mhm,
now actually this has empowered me to work
mhm,
more, because suddenly I can work in a place that is not an office.
mhm,
So, I think as well, like it had this kind of like big impact on like the way that we work. And, I know that obviously there's been some backtracking from like tech companies, etc. But I do think, that's like one reasonable adjustment that so many people were asking for a really long time. And then all of a sudden, it was kind of like, oh, well, this absolutely has to happen. And that's been a massive game changer. I mean, would I kind of wish a global pandemic on a society? Absolutely not. But
mhm.
it definitely had like some like positive impacts. And I think, just as you were saying, it was a mass disabling event, but
Mhm.
actually, it did have those kind of like positive knock-on impacts in terms of things like research into like chronic fatigue and POTS and all those things that had kind of been a little bit ignored, all of a sudden were kind of, you know, on a really substantial like rising trajectory. And yeah, it's definitely kind of, I know people that have kind of benefited from that, like additional research and understanding. Um, so yeah, it was definitely a really kind of interesting period of time. And I definitely look back and think, well, actually, yeah, my business probably wouldn't look like it looks had it have not happened. Um, Mainly because I guess I was like so angry.
So, let's talk more about SIC. SIC offers community education and advocacy. How do you plan and pace all those different efforts dealing with bodies that don't follow a predictable schedule health-wise?
Yeah, I think this is honestly something that I am still working out. I always kind of think that like my chronic illness and my ADHD don't really kind of get on in some ways because
Mm.
like my ADHD is like, I want to do all these things and it's going to be amazing and I'm going to make all these really impulsive decisions and agree to like doing three things in like the same week. And then my
Mhm.
body's like, no, like that was a really bad idea. But I actually think that I'm getting better at recognizing how those two things happen. And I also think I'm getting a little bit better at kind of calming that impulsivity and kind of taking sometimes like a bit of a step back when I'm kind of making those sorts of plans. Um, I don't think it's perfect though. I mean, I try and kind of plan in periods of rest. I also try and like not punish myself. Like if I'm kind of like, you know what, like I've got a really busy week, what would really help me is just doing a little bit of work over the weekend. I'm trying to kind of like not judge myself for doing that because I know kind of that like future me will see the benefits. If I've got a really big deadline and I know I've got like quite a lot of meetings, like I'd rather kind of do something, on a weekend as opposed to suddenly being like, oh, and I just accidentally worked a 12-hour day, which was definitely kind of getting sometimes into the habit of. But at the same time, I also just have to recognize that, sometimes I am going to get it wrong. I'm not going to pace properly, and I am going to end up in burnout. And I'm just trying to make sure that I'm putting as much as possible in place. So, like, even for example, at the bottom of my emails, I've got something that says, I work around my disability. So I might be emailing you at a bit of an unusual time. And if I am, like, please do not feel like you have to respond. And, even kind of little things like this, like that, it's a little bit of a reminder to myself that I just need to like give myself that kind of breathing space and let myself do things that might not be as convenient for other people, but actually do help me.
I think grace is such an important factor here, because as much as we can plan and use systems that help mitigate our symptoms, we're still going to have periods where we just have a lot of
Yeah.
work to do, or we misestimate how much we're capable of on a single day and, overdo it. And so having grace for sometimes you're going to screw up, sometimes you're going to need to take some time off and rest. And
Yeah.
we're all people, and that's okay, right?
Yeah, and I've also definitely become a little bit better at, saying no to things. Like,
Mm,
especially I think when you're an entrepreneur, like you get invited quite a lot to like, oh, do you want to come to this like free business breakfast or like whatever
mm,
it is? And actually, initially you're like, oh, well, one of the main things that all these successful business people talk about is how important it is to network.
mm.
But actually, I've got a lot better at being like, am I needed here? Like, is it gonna actually add any value? Like, yes or no? And then be like, yeah, that would be really lovely to do, but I'm not going to do it. Like, even if it's just an online thing, like I'm just sort of like, well, yeah, I'm at capacity. I can't say yes. Um, and that can feel really hard because I'm definitely a bit of a people pleaser, but um, I think it's better to kind of know your limits and plan in that time to just kind of catch up on things, and mainly the things to catch up on are sleep.
Yeah. So, likewise, what have you learned about building kind of a team culture that supports lots of different people and bodies and brains that might not all be working on the same schedule and change all the time?
Yeah, so this is a really good one. So in terms of like my kind of core team, so I have my PA who works for me 4 days a week, which is actually part funded by a government grant scheme called Access to Work that we have in the UK. And then as of very recently, I've got somebody else who works a sort of day a week, helping me with some of the kind of more like high level operations things. And then I've got a couple of associate consultants, and then a board that all kind of bring a real variety of lived experiences. And I think the big things are absolutely kind of having those like lines of communication. And I don't mean like being available at all times on like
Mhm.
WhatsApp or Slack or whatever, but I'm meaning just, being really clear about things so that, when I'm off sick or, a colleague, isn't around or is kind of working within their own kind of days and times and working within their own energy, that it's quite easy to be able to like pick things up. So, even if that's kind of like a summary email being like, right, I'm not going to be online for the next couple of days, but this is kind of what you need to know and like what needs to be actioned. And that's really, really helped. And also kind of we use a few like bits and pieces, like we have Slack, and the expectation very much is like, if somebody's messaging you on Slack and you're not there, like you'll just be offline, so you're just not going to see it. But also things like Asana as well, so that, everybody kind of knows like, oh, I'm working on this project, and actually when this is done, X person might need to like sign this off, or I just need to do these three actions so that this is completely finished. But yeah, I mean, it's really different, obviously, because when I started my career, we were so embedded in that kind of like 9 to 5, like office culture. Everybody was working at the same time.
Mhm.
And instead, now it's kind of creating an organization where we are really, really flexible. And, that means that sometimes if you want an answer to something, you're just not going to get it for a few days, and that's completely fine. But yeah, I mean, it's like an ongoing learning of trying to really kind of like embed that so that everybody feels like they can contribute and they're bringing loads of value to the organization, but they're not necessarily, online at the same time as other people. And actually, you know what? I think it works really well in the sense that, somebody might not be online and somebody else might sort of pick something up. And actually, sometimes it actually means that things happen faster because, if
Mm.
somebody gets an energy burst in the evening and somebody like me gets a massive energy slump, actually, sometimes it can be quite nice because it kind of just like rolls into each other. But yeah, it's like the biggest thing definitely has been around that communication.
So you're building in the idea of teamwork, communication, documentation to support a really asynchronous working schedule so that people can pop in
Yeah.
and off as they're able to and work keeps going without everybody
Mhm.
having to rigidly 9 to 5 in office all day.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you handle decision making and strategy work on days when your brain fog is really high or you're really fatigued and your brain is just not braining the way you want it to?
I feel like I constantly am like, my brain is not braining. And yeah, I mean, I think honestly it is really hard. Like sometimes you just have to be like, you know what? Like this is not working.
Mm,
Like my brain is not braining today. Like I need to take like a pause from this and do something that is going to be a bit more easy, a bit more rewarding, like get that dopamine up. And, sometimes you've just got to like reshuffle around energy and brain fog. And I think again, it's that grace that we were just talking about of like being like, yeah, like I'm going to give myself grace. I'm going to recognize actually I cannot do this today. But I think some of the big things is because we're a non-profit. I'm really lucky in many ways to have a board around me. And they're not that involved like day to day. We have our board meetings. Some of them will have like specific projects they might be working on. But if I am like really, really struggling, say for example, like going through a period of really bad health, actually being able to kind of lean on them and be like, look, this is something I'm really finding challenging. Does anyone have any capacity to kind of help with this, or help kind of even just like go through like with me like what the pros and cons are of a specific way of working. That's something that I've definitely got better at doing in the last year. I've had my board now for nearly 3 years, but I haven't necessarily utilized them as much. But actually, over the last year, I've really recognized that actually, if I am really struggling, there is help available. Um, and that has been something that, I've definitely felt a bit of guilt around of like, why can't I do this? Like, why am I finding this so hard? But actually, rather than punish myself, asking for help has been like the best thing.
mhm. Because like we don't all have the same exact talents and skills, and some people are better suited for certain things than others, and so there
Yeah,
shouldn't really be this stigma and shame around, oh, I can't do
yeah,
this one thing, so what's wrong with me? It should be like, oh, I'll just ask the person who can do that thing and then do the things that I'm good at.
absolutely. And I think that's always the challenge with any form of entrepreneurship. It's like you have to become the accountant, the marketeer, the salesperson, the person that's delivering, HR, like how many of those skills does any other person have? Like it's
Mhm.
really hard, and like yeah, and it is really hard sometimes to be at that point where you ask for help. But I actually, and even for example in the past, like if I've been having a really challenging time and I really really need something, like I've literally just put something out on LinkedIn and had really amazing responses from people being like, yeah, I would like really love to like help you, like I'll give you kind of like some of my expertise. And I think, having that kind of like openness and vulnerability, I definitely have found like has some real positives to it.
So, speaking about openness and vulnerability, you're very open about being chronically ill as a CEO. What kind of reactions do you hear a lot from people who've never really considered that an option and questioned the traditional idea of what leadership has to be?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes one of two ways. I think for a lot of fellow disabled and neurodivergent people, like we're like, oh, I've not necessarily thought about that. And I would kind of actually really like to explore that a bit more. Like for me, like what does that mean for me? And whenever I can, I try and be quite kind of open to having, conversations with people that maybe be kind of thinking about that for them. I wish I could do more, but I definitely try and fit that in because I didn't really have anyone to speak to when I was kind of first starting out. And then I think when it comes to non-disabled people, there can definitely be a bit of an element of like that sort of like inspiration porn of like, wow, like you've done this, even though like you've had all of these barriers. And that can definitely kind of verge on a little bit grating. Um, but I do try and kind of bring that kind of like educational like openness of like, well, actually the reason that I'm doing this is because I faced so many barriers that
Mm.
actually this became weirdly almost like the easiest route. And
Yeah.
actually, what can you do as somebody who is non-disabled, or I quite often say, not yet disabled, like most of us will become
Mm.
disabled at some point in our lives. What can you do to like be an ally? Because that's the most important thing. Being like, oh wow, you're doing such a great job is one thing, but actually, what doors can you open? Because the doors are kind of limited when it comes to, being an entrepreneur, being disabled. I was saying right at the very beginning about, how I was always deemed quite high risk in the workplace,
Mhm.
but actually I'm still deemed as quite high risk as an entrepreneur. Like, um, funding opportunities are really limited. Even despite the fact that a lot of the work I do is very much kind of embedded in that sort of disability and what that really means.
Mhm.
I definitely still think that, if an organization has a choice between a disabled person and a non-disabled led organization, they still quite often tend to favor that non-disabled led organization. So, it's kind of trying to be like, yeah, okay, maybe I'm kind of providing this like inspiration porn or whatever, but like I now want to encourage you to actually um, take an action away from
Mm.
this as well.
Right. So don't just feel good in yourself and feel inspired because look, a disabled
Yeah.
person is doing something so, awesome. But instead ask yourself, how can I make it easier for disabled people to
Mm.
live dignified lives without
Yeah.
having to jump through every hoop? How can I make it so that you don't see a disabled CEO and go, oh my God, how
Yeah,
inspirational? Just go, oh, that's just another CEO. Sometimes people are disabled.
absolutely. And also, if somebody themselves is an entrepreneur, it's like, okay, well, how can I make sure that my products and services are accessible
Mm.
to disabled people? How can I ensure that, oh, I need a designer to help me with a piece of work? How can I ensure that maybe actually I'm opening up these opportunities to disabled-led businesses? There's so many things that we can do when it comes to allyship, and I'm always really trying to kind of question people, maybe. I mean, sometimes I then go into like total panic of being like, I've just maybe pushed it a little bit too far. But actually, I think it is really important sometimes to just challenge people a bit as well.
Mm. So, what are some of the things that you're most proud of when you look at the impact you've made so far? And what impacts do you still feel like you're driven to continue making?
Yeah, so about a year or so ago, we did something called a reverse jobs fair where we supported 20 disabled people who were either un or underemployed with about 10 weeks of training. We matched them up with mentors, and then basically gave everybody the opportunity to like showcase themselves to employers. So rather than a traditional jobs fair where you've got, a bunch of employers being like, look how fantastic we are. Instead, it was like actually disabled people saying, look how fantastic we are to employers. And it was the first time I'd done anything like that. And I'm looking at the moment and many different routes to kind of fund like follow-on programs. But it had a really amazing impact in terms of employment. So, um, 6 months after the project, over half of the people that we'd supported were either back in employment or actually pursuing self-employment. Um, and there were some like amazing success stories. So, like, for example, somebody who'd been out of the workplace for about 7 years, and because they were one of the oldest people in this cohort of people. They were kind of like, well, not only have I got the bias around being disabled, but I've also got the bias around age. And they managed to get a role that was like honestly perfect for them. And they actually sent a really, really amazing, lovely email being like, this has really kind of changed my life. And, that is such an amazing impact to have that really positive impact on somebody's life. And there were also like loads of impacts that weren't around employment, around things like reduced isolation, people making some of their first friendships in adulthood, and all of these like really wonderful things. And even though it was a relatively small project, and we've done some things that are like bigger and more impressive, like to me it's definitely kind of like my favorite thing that's ever kind of happened within the business, because I was able to like build quite close relationships with the people that were going through that program. I feel like I kind of knew everybody like relatively well. So then seeing that like positive impact that it was actually having on like the individual people was just a really, really wonderful thing to see.
I can't imagine how fulfilling it must have been to look at that and be like, I helped. And, you get to know the people too. So it's not just, oh, I
Yeah.
helped some people. It's I helped these people that I know and have grown to care about,
Yeah.
and just the
Yeah.
supportive community that you've grown.
And also, like, I think this was the other thing that was really, really nice was that, I'm in my like mid-30s now. So I kind of felt confident in some ways around the support that I could give people who are either like leaving school or university, or maybe kind of like up to sort of their mid-20s or whatever, because like I kind of been there, done that. But what was really nice was actually being trusted with people that by people that were actually in many ways further along their careers, and
Mhm.
still seeing that really amazing kind of like impact around, them kind of being like, what, this has given me the opportunity to realize that I really want to go and become a freelancer, and this is what I want to do. I'm going to do some courses, etc., etc. And being trusted by people that in many ways have so much more life experience to bring was just a really like wonderful thing. And then seeing like the friendships and things build as well was also just like really, really lovely. Like people kind of recognizing themselves in some of the other people in the cohort and like building a really strong friendship was just lovely, to be honest.
So, what message do you want to get out there for sick and disabled people to hear when they're doubting themselves or feeling pushed out of the workplace and don't know how they're going to succeed and make a life for themselves?
I think I never want to kind of say to somebody, oh, just like keep pushing, like it will happen, because why should we have to work harder to achieve sometimes kind of less than our like peers and the people around us? But I think it's really around like exploring different routes. For example, in your town, there might not be roles that actually work for you, but what remote opportunities are available kind of
Mhm.
nationwide? Or, could you earn a sort of sustainable amount of money working part-time as a self-employed person or as an entrepreneur? And I do think, just in general, like when we come to anything about careers, it's very much like, oh, the goal is a job, but actually the goal should be like the right job, the right employer, and sometimes that's not even an employer. Um, so I always just would say that, I really encourage people to kind of like look around at like different options and opportunities, build a network, even if it's just online with fellow disabled people that are going to have your back and be quite open to having conversations with you. And yeah, kind of recognize that just because a certain pathway that everyone around you is taking is present to you doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the right thing. So, be really kind of open to that sort of exploration.
Kind of encourage creative outside the box thinking. Don't
Yeah.
limit yourself to the path that you feel you must do, but look at all the other ways that you could creatively make things work, even if it's not a traditional path.
And I totally recognise, we've all got external pressures. It could be our parents, it could be our partners, it could be whoever kind of being like, well, why are you not doing this? It could solely be a total financial pressure. But, for example, like when we were doing the reverse jobs fair, there were absolutely people that were like, well, there's not a job that's appropriate for me in my kind of 10-mile radius of my house. And it was like, okay, well, what about working from home and actually doing something remote? Like, is there opportunities there? And that kind of, it sounds like a really simple change that people can make, but actually, sometimes we just need to be reminded that, there are other ways of doing things, and they can actually be better suited to us. But yeah, I think disabled people just in general, we're really good at thinking outside the box. So yeah, I think it's a natural thing, but sometimes we don't necessarily do that when we're thinking about our careers. And I know I kind of got stuck into a bit of a cycle of being like, oh, well, I'll just leave this job and go for another one. Whereas actually the thing that, is my longest thing on my CV was becoming self-employed. And I just kind of didn't really make that leap. But now I'm like, oh, I've done this for 5 years. I didn't manage to do anything else for much more than 18 months.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Alice, so much for all of your incredible insight and knowledge on systems and working and creating jobs for disabled people and thinking outside the box. I had such a wonderful time with you today, and I hope our listeners gained some great insights today as well that can help them in their journeys. It was so lovely having you, and yeah, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me.
Bye.